Is it too late for diplomacy when it comes to efforts to stop the tyrannical Islamist theocrats in Iran? As the Trump administration continues to try diplomacy while U.S. military forces are openly deployed into the region to threaten a renewal of the strikes conducted against Tehran last summer, the question is not so much whether talks with a regime that has no intention of giving up its nuclear ambitions or its support for terrorism can succeed. Rather, it's whether a president who came into office pledging not to get into any wars in the Middle East will use force to ensure that the mullahs are not only restrained, but toppled. This week on Think Twice, with veteran diplomat Elliott Abrams, we unpack American foreign policy in the age of Donald Trump. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. Today we have an important conversation for you with veteran diplomat and author Elliott Abrams about the Trump administration's foreign policy. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, that whether you're listening to us on any of the podcast platforms or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to Think Twice, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Also, in addition to Think Twice, there is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel, wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. Would you characterize a president who bombed Iranian nuclear facilities, sent troops into Venezuela to capture its narco-terrorist president, and is trying to get Denmark to sell Greenland as an isolationist? Ironically, that's how many supposedly smart people still think of President Donald Trump. Defining his America First policies has always been as much a matter of projection for many of his supporters and his opponents. But it's clear that in his second term, Trump is no longer shy about intervening abroad when he thinks it's consistent with defending American interests. That doesn't make him a neoconservative, a term that once actually meant something, but in the last 20 years has come to be solely linked to support for the failed wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and the futile quest to bring democracy to countries that don't want it. But can a president who promised the Iranian people that help was on the way afford to betray them by making a deal with their oppressors? But even if he wants to topple the Islamic regime, is that something that the United States can actually accomplish with or without Israeli help? More to the point, can an American foreign policy that seems to be rooted in a disdain for multilateral institutions like the UN, as well as for Washington's traditional European allies, overcome the resistance it is getting for a foreign policy establishment on both sides of the Atlantic? Will Trump's board of peace actually bring peace to Gaza or anywhere else? And what will a national security strategy that is focused more on the Americas as well as on the need to confront and or contain China than involvement in the Middle East succeed? To discuss all that, we're pleased to have with us today not merely a veteran diplomat, but one of the most astute observers of American foreign policy. Elliott Abrams is a senior fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and chairman of the Tikvah Fund. He has had a long career in foreign policy, serving in the Reagan, George W. Bush, and Trump administrations, and is the author of several books, including Tested by Zion, the Bush administration and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, The Influence of Faith, and Faith or Fear, How Jews Can Survive in a Christian America, Realism and Democracy, American Foreign Policy After the Arab Spring, and, if you will it, Rebuilding a Jewish Peoplehood for the 21st Century. Elliott Abrams, welcome back to Think Twice.
I'm very glad to be back.
Well, Elliott, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start with the question that has been on everyone's mind in recent weeks. What's next between the U.S. and Iran? I won't ask you for a prediction as to whether the U.S. and Iran will reach some kind of agreement or if, as it did last June, the United States will attack Iran. But do you think the diplomacy that is going on between the two is set up to succeed? And what would you characterize as a good outcome to the talks, assuming one is possible? And is a deal that can last even possible with Tehran?
There's some yeses and nos in here, so let me go through it. I think the talks, as you and I are speaking, have already, in essence, failed. They only had one round. And though the Iranians said after it, oh, the enormous amounts of progress made, actually the American side was much less positive. And I think it was Vice President Vance who said they don't accept any of our red lines. So, the president always likes to negotiate things and then claim victory. And I still fear that he might do that here, but I think it's very, very hard for a number of reasons, one of them being the JCPOA. It isn't as if he's drawing on a blank slate here. There was an agreement that was time limited and dealt only with nuclear issues. And he is among the many people, particularly Republicans, who called it a great disaster. That happened. So for him to accept the terms that Iran is offering, well, for 3 years, obviously 3 years, because then he's gone, we won't enrich uranium, and then we won't enrich much uranium, but we're not talking about anything else, about missiles or terrorist prophecy. I don't think he can accept that because he knows that he would be derided by many, many Americans for accepting, in essence, what Barack Obama accepted. So why is he doing it then? And I think, there's a 1% chance, I would think in his mind, that after the attacks last year by the United States and Israel and the internal troubles they're having now, the regime would accept something real. More of it, I think, is that the Arabs are saying, don't attack, don't attack. And I think he wants to be able to say, look, we sat down and talked to them. We gave them off-ramps. They're impossible.
As he did last summer.
Yes. Yeah, we tried. And anyway, if he were to strike, let's say in late February, from the day this started, he needed 2 weeks, more or less, to get all the American forces in place. It looks as if they'll be in place by, say, February 20th. I mean, it would be amazing, were he to attack on Purim, a holiday reminiscent of Persia.
Which will, yeah.
Yes, which is coming. So I think, as you said, we're estimating here, we're guessing. I have no secret information. But I think it's fair to say there cannot be an acceptable negotiated deal because the regime is unwilling to accept it. I just said one more thing. They're particularly unwilling to accept a reasonable deal now for fear of it looking like weakness. After the whole populace rose up against them, they will feel they can't afford to look weak by making compromises with the Americans.
Before we jump in, a quick invitation. The 2026 JNS International Policy Summit is coming up this April. It will be held from April 15th through the 17th, once again at the Waldorf Astoria in Jerusalem. I'll be there, and I'll hope you'll join us too. You can visit jns-summit.org to register and see the speaker lineup. It's an exceptional group and well worth your time. I'll look forward to meeting you in Jerusalem this April. I want to talk about that issue about, the survival of the regime in a moment. But first, let me ask you, they don't want to look weak, but if they get pasted again, as they did last June, and they can't have any really good expectations of a military confrontation with the U.S. or the U.S. and Israel or any combination of the two, won't that put them in an even worse position than they are now when they're supposedly, afraid of looking weak?
Well, yes and no. I mean, from one point of view, sure, their missile program and nuclear program will presumably be even in worse shape. And maybe their economy will be in worse shape.
And maybe some of them individually, their leadership will be in worse shape.
But, they, like the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, the PA, like to use words like steadfastness. We will never give in. We will never compromise. So what they would be saying to the Iranian people is, we're willing to fight. We're willing to go to war. We're willing to take punishment. It won't overthrow the regime. That is, let us say we obliterate whatever is left of their nuclear program and has been rebuilt since last June, and do tremendous damage to their missile program. They don't use those for internal controls, If that's what we do, I mean, those are hugely important targets. But the regime will have showed its, what can we call it, bloody-mindedness. They would call it steadfastness. And in that sense, maybe it's a warning to the Iranian people, we're here, we're still here, and we have the means to do what we did in January, which is we have the willpower and the guns to kill thousands and thousands of citizens. So from the internal point of view, they're not immediately weaker, I would say. Question would be the economic impact over the rest of the year, for example.
Yeah, that's a very important point, because I don't think, a lot of observers think of them in the same sense as the way we think about not just the Palestinian Authority, but Hamas, which views the war with Israel as, a generational, multi-generational struggle, and it doesn't really matter whether they, lose again because they think they're going to win in 100 years. If Iran is thinking the same way, if Iran's leaders are thinking the same way, obviously that has consequences. Now, a lot of the expectation around the current confrontation with them revolves around the idea, as we just said, of regime change in the wake of the massive protests against the Islamic government, which has been brutally repressed. And after Trump promised the Iranian people that help was on the way, what would be the impact on Trump's ability to conduct a successful foreign policy in the remaining 3 years of his term in office if, with respect to that, he has like an Obama-like red line retreat on Iran?
Everything is related to everything else. And, we have all said on the positive side that, for example, the brilliant performance in Midnight Hammer, the brilliant military performance in Venezuela have got to be lessons to Xi Jinping and to Putin about the his willingness to use force and about the exceptional abilities of the American military. The coin has two sides. And if he appears to back away, particularly in the face of threats from Iran, and they have threatened, for example, we'll damage your economy, we'll close the Strait of Hormuz. If he backs down and takes the JCPOA Mark II, it has an impact on everyone, and particularly on enemies like Russia and China, suggesting, he'll do what he can do overnight. Because if you think of the 3 times he's used force, Soleimani, Midnight Hammer, Venezuela, it in a sense, it's over when he announces it. Mm-hmm. And they might conclude, well, you see, here there was a possibility of it being 2 days or 4 days or 10 days. He wouldn't do it. And that would be a very dangerous conclusion for them to reach. Dangerous for us.
Yeah. Well, as you just referenced, Trump's somewhat surprising move against Venezuela when he captured its dictator, but then basically let a destructive socialist regime allied with our enemy survive, just Sans Maduro, with it continuing under his vice president. Does that give us any insight as to what might happen with Iran, or is that sort of operation followed by a decision to avoid regime change not really analogous to what is possible in Tehran?
That's a very difficult question. And Venezuela is, in comparison, a much smaller target and has about a third of the population and is much closer to the United States. And, I've talked to people who said, why can't we go and grab Khamenei? And, for one thing, Tehran is not a port city. If you're going to do this from the sea, that matters. Jimmy Carter found that out the hard way, going hundreds of miles into Iran. But I think it's worrying for the Iranian people that the president would be willing to accept the same regime with a few changes in policy. So far, that's where we are in Venezuela. Now, maybe that changes. And Secretary Rubio in particular has talked about transition, and elections were moving awfully slowly. But I think that ought to be the worry for a lot of Iranians. There are other ways the Ayatollah can go. He's old and sick, and he can leave office by dying a natural death. That's not going to bring the regime.
But there are more mullahs where he came from. It's not like he's the only person who can run that regime.
No, although I must say, I think, it is fundamentally a theocracy. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it will be after his death. That is, he is the supreme leader. For people like Soleimani, who was in their system a very big shot, the supreme leader can still give an order. No, you will not do that. And it was followed. I don't think they'll have another supreme leader. I think they'll have another mullah, and he'll be an ayatollah. But I think it'll be closer to a military dictatorship. I don't think whoever is named supreme leader will be able to simply give orders with the absolute assurance they're going to be followed. You will not do that. You will do this. Because there isn't anybody with that kind of prestige left in the system.
That's interesting. The Islamic Republic has only had one real transition of power.
Yes.
In its 47 years of history. That's an open question. I'm sure there may be some junior mullahs who think they can be a supreme leader, but until it happens, we don't know.
We don't. I mean, Khamenei himself was not a very big religious leader. He was a kind of jumped up Ayatollah. Those
people in that level. I mean, they're all like members of the U.S. Senate who look in the mirror, and all 100 of them see a future president.
But it's an interesting analogy because it is like having the senator who's 50th in seniority be made president of the Senate. Mm. He was not that high-ranking an Ayatollah, nor was he very distinguished, but he was chosen. There are not a million candidates. Every government in the region and in Europe and here as well, the State Department, CIA, have done their analyses of who are the most likely to succeed. But I think, people have said it will resemble Pakistan more, and I think that's right as a military dictatorship with a kind of facade of religiosity.
Does that make it more pliable, or because it's somebody coming from a military or sort of military terrorist background with the IRGC?
Well, that's going to end up being, I think, a very, very important question unless the regime is overthrown. I'll give you a very firm maybe. They will not be as motivated, by theology. But communist ideology, Marxism, Leninism, is no longer the guiding ideology really in Russia, yet it is as vicious and aggressive as it was under the Soviets. So I guess you could say that some of the same thing about China. So I would not say that we can assume that a military dictatorship Iran, this regime with a weak Ayatollah would be any better behaved at all.
Yeah. Well, next, I'd like your take on Trump's Board of Peace initiative. He said that it's not an attempt to replace the UN, but giving the Trump the ability to make an end round around the UN seems to be its main point, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think the whole thing is frankly absurd. And I don't think it's going to achieve anything. Today, the Board of Peace, the day you and I are speaking, met in Washington for a couple of hours. The president spoke and gave the kind of speech that he usually does, covering a number of subjects. Everybody else was limited to 2 minutes. So it was the Donald Trump show. Some commitments were announced. The president announced $10 billion. Congress will have to appropriate that. Will it? No way of knowing. Indonesia announced its 8,000 troops. But no one, literally no one, has offered troops that would fight or disarm Hamas. I think that at the, let's say, the ground level, these Gaza activities can be useful. That is, I have a high regard, for example, for Mladenov, the Bulgarian diplomat, who's going to play a significant role in what they're now calling the Gaza Executive Committee, which is 2 layers down from the Board of Peace. There's a Board of Peace, Executive Committee, Gaza Executive Committee, and then this Palestinian National Commission or Committee. And maybe they can do some good. They seem to be engineers and professionals. And if they dedicate themselves to restoring public services, water, sewage, roads, that will do some good. But none of it is serious unless Hamas is disarmed. And the Board of Peace is not going to disarm. Board of Peace. When is it going to even meet again? And we know that it has a shelf life of 3 years because President Trump has appointed himself the perpetual head of it. Well, whoever is president next is, going to marginalize it, I'm confident. So I don't think we should view it as a serious actor. And I think the fundamental question remains. Reconstruction of Gaza cannot happen without the disarming of Hamas. And no one is coming forward to disarm Hamas, except, in the end, the IDF.
Yeah, well, that's the one thing that the Board of Peace is supposed to be doing, which is transitioning the Gaza ceasefire into permanent peace. Yet we know that Hamas is not going to hand over power or actually disarm. So the whole thing is set up to fail unless Trump gives Israel the green light to finish off Hamas, something I'm pretty sure that both the U.S. and an Israeli government that probably doesn't want another war before elections that are held this year, they're not enthused about it either. So are we just going to spend the rest of this year, watching Hamas dig in and rebuild its infrastructure in the parts of Gaza that it still holds?
Yes, but we're also going to watch Israel attack that. And they've been doing that regularly. They do it almost every day.
Right.
It is, I think, shocking to a lot of Americans to see what's still there. For example, in tunnels. But yes, I think, we have elections. Israel has elections. That takes us to November. The year is almost over. So I think what we have seen in the last few months since the so-called ceasefire is what we'll see for the rest of this year. Hamas making every effort to bring in guns by drones or however else they can do it. Israel in the half of Gaza that it does not control attacking to prevent the rebuilding of Hamas. The question really is whether any positive movement can take place in the slightly more than half of Gaza Israel has, the east of the Yellow Line. For example, in Rafah, where the Emirates seems to be ready to invest up to $1 billion in rebuilding. And, in that area where the IDF is in control, you could do that. And that would be a good thing to do.
Yeah, well, that would be a possibility. Of course, Israel striking at, the part of Gaza that Hamas still holds, they can't really do anything about the tunnels, and the tunnels are really the key to their maintaining control, aren't they?
They're part of it. The other part is just having so many guns. Thousands and thousands and thousands. We've all heard the estimate, 60,000. The Israelis are trying to do something here. We keep reading news stories about Israeli help for other groups in the western half of Gaza that resist Hamas, that fight back against Hamas. We'll see that continuing for the rest of this year as well.
Well, both of us are kind of old enough to remember when, Ariel Sharon, thought that the solution for, Judea and Samaria was the village leagues. Do those kinds of proposals ever really work? Can anyone successfully oppose Hamas from within Gaza among the Palestinians? Or is that really a pipe dream?
Yeah, as you do know, there's a long argument here. The beginning of sin here was probably Oslo and bringing Yasser Arafat back from exile. And I also think it was not inevitable that this happened in Gaza. Hamas took control, and at the time, Prime Minister Sharon said, if we get attacked out of Gaza at all, we will strike 10 times harder. And Israel did not do that. Now, you can attribute it to Sharon's being in poor health. And some of that early period is when between his first and second strokes. You can attribute it to bad policy, lack of willpower on the part of the government of Israel. But Hamas was reasonably weak back then. We're talking about late 2005.
Right.
So I don't think it was inevitable, but it was obviously Hamas's goal, and the Israelis did not, at that point, intervene much. And so,
well, that's the thing. When you wash your hands of an area, you're not really going to be quick to go back in, despite, threats.
Right. Or go back in more than every other year or something like that, every 3 years. And so that was one turning point when Hamas began to rebuild, and Israel did not stop them, including stop them from lobbing rockets into Israel. The other was the Hamas takeover. That is, when they kicked out Fatah. And at that point, it appeared that the Palestinian Authority and Fatah had them outgunned. They had, theoretically, something like 30,000 men under arms, and Hamas had 10,000. And both of those numbers, I think, were wrong. Hamas had more. And the PA had less because they were, in thousands of cases, phantoms. That is, a captain would report that he had 500 men under him so he could get 500 salaries.
Like a mafia-dominated work
they wouldn't
site.
Fight.
No-show jobs and, non-existent jobs. Yeah.
And they wouldn't fight.
work jobs.
So when the crunch came, it only took, as I recall it, 6 days for Hamas to just crush Fatah in Gaza. And then really the worst period began, because then Hamas was fully in charge. Your question was really, is it conceivable that Israel could back enough Palestinian opponents of Hamas to defeat Hamas? it would be a major, major and continuing effort, which will have no support outside of Israel, including maybe from the United States, because it's a formula for continued friction and fighting. And I would say, that President Trump doesn't want that. I mean, he wants stability, as he does in Venezuela.
Yeah, he doesn't want a Palestinian civil war, but that was like Rabin's logic of Oslo, is that Arafat will fight Hamas, and he won't have the Israeli Supreme Court to tell him what to do. But that never worked out.
No. It is true, of course, that Fatah and Hamas are longtime enemies. But it's also true that Hamas has just been much, much stronger. It seems to be its cadres are more committed ideologically, and its leadership, though corrupt, is less corrupt.
And I guess the point is that anytime anybody has tried this, they're depicted as traitors within the political culture of the Palestinians, which is sort of predicated on resistance to Israel and armed conflict. So it's always a dead end.
It is, which is why I'm not optimistic at all about what is the future of Western Gaza. I mean, the outcome here from an Israeli national security point of view is in some ways a good one. That is, the size of the territory that Hamas controls has been cut by half. And there are very significant buffer zones, north, south, and east of that Hamas area. And Israel has kept control of the border with Egypt. All of those are very significant gains. So for Hamas to rearm with the kind of heavy weaponry it had, very, very difficult. That's a real gain. But the kind of reconstruction that everybody is talking about of a new Gaza, which is predicated on security, I think there is no reason to believe that will happen.
Right. Well, going beyond Gaza and the Board of Peace, I think a broader question that needs to be addressed is what to make of American foreign policy under Trump 2.0. The national security strategy it unveiled a couple of months ago was aiming at greater focus on the Americas and China and less on Europe and the Middle East. Yet outside of Venezuela, we've been talking pretty much nonstop about relations with Europe and our NATO allies and the Middle East. What did you think of that document? And while obviously policy is not always the same thing as papers about doctrine, do you think it gives us any insights about this administration's behavior?
Yeah, I think if you take the national security strategy, the national defense strategy, and the Munich Security Conference. So, what's the administration saying? Secretary Rubio, Vice President Vance, these documents, they've certainly raised the profile of the Western Hemisphere. Whether that is a justification for Venezuela ex post facto, different question, but they've certainly suggested that we would like to have the government of Cuba fall, and just get these foreign bodies out of the Western Hemisphere, foreign bodies that are linked to China, to Russia, to Iran. That's pretty straightforward, I think. What concerns me a lot is this transactionalism. You heard it, for example, from the Undersecretary of Defense, Elbridge Colby, in Munich, where he said, we need to build relationships on the basis of what really lasts and matters, interests, not on issues that come and go. And he, shibboleths was one word he used, values. And that seems to me to be worrying because it's completely wrong. I think values are much more enduring and significant. If you ask me, for example, interests, is it in our interest to have a defense treaty with Germany Well, my answer is it 1939 or is it 1949? Our interests change. If you ask me whether it's in our interest that Germany be a democratic country that respects human rights, that will never change. The answer is yes. So I think the idea that the administration has of playing down the importance of values, of democracy, of freedom, liberty, human rights in our alliances is a mistake. And because that's at the heart of our greatest alliances, Japan, Australia, South Korea, Philippines, in Asia, the NATO allies. Obviously, there are countries that we are allied with that are not democracies, that are excellent partners. Take the United Arab Emirates, for example. But the fundamentals of our alliances are, I would say, values-based, including our alliance with Israel. So that worried me. I'd say one other thing here, and it's kind of odd echo of Barack Obama, but I think the administration undervalues having alliances. I think President Obama kind of saw allies as a pain, an albatross.
And I did like multilateral institutions, which this administration does not.
That's true. But all these alliances are, I think, seen by the administration as a problem. Where I would argue that, it's one of the things that strengthens us and weakens Russia and China. They don't really have alliances. They have common interests with each other in opposing us. But, who are China's allies? Maybe North Korea?
And not maybe even them, yeah.
Yeah, and we have these global alliances. So I'm worried by these documents. Secretary Rubio made what was in some ways a very good speech, and the Europeans appreciated it. But a word was missing in his speech, really quite striking? Russia. The word Russia. And we're at a moment when there is the greatest land war in Europe since World War II, where Russia has invaded an independent country, Ukraine, has killed tens of thousands of people, has taken part of its territory. It's the largest thing the Europeans are thinking about. And this is a security conference in Germany, and he didn't mention Russia. He did mention the Soviet Union, looking back historically. But so I worry about this administration's devaluing of our key alliances.
Well, I guess the rejoinder, from the administration would be, not that I'm speaking for either, Marco Rubio or J.D. Vance, is that, if you're going to speak of Russia as it is now, as if, it's about to, which some of the European allies do speak in this way, as if Russia is a threat to overrun all of Western Europe. I guess their rejoinder would be is that it's 2026, not 1987, when the Soviet Union, with its Warsaw Pact allies, were stationed in the middle of Germany. The Warsaw Pact is long dead, and Russia can't even conquer Ukraine. So why should the United States obsess about Russia?
Because it's an enemy of ours. Because what Russia and China have in common is a strong desire to dethrone the United States as the strongest country in the world and the center of a global set of alliances. So they are dangerous to us, I think, and capable of doing us great harm. I mean, the president is certainly right, in my view, in suggesting that the Europeans have to do a lot more for their own defense, and right in saying, actually, it's the vice president who's been clear about this, that, their living standards, their welfare states, their ability, to retire young, are based in part on the fact that they have not had to spend money on their own defense. Well, you need only say that to say, well, that's crazy. Why would we accept that?
Yeah.
Many presidents complained about it, but they didn't do anything about it until Donald Trump. And his a strong push on this is working. But then you get unforced errors on our part, like I would say Greenland, whose importance I think the president is right about, given its geography. But I think when you look at what the agreements we're going to make with Denmark about, or have made, about being able to include Greenland actively in our defense from attacks in the Arctic by the Russians, we could have had those in a one-day meeting. The crisis was needless.
Well, I guess, one of the things I'd like to ask, sort of drill down a little bit more about Munich, was the NATO nations were, as you said, pleased that it was Secretary of State Marco Rubio speaking to them and not Vice President J.D. Vance. But though Rubio's address was more soothing, or at least less confrontational, wasn't the substance of it, as I think you're alluding to, at least with, the fact that he didn't talk about Russia and he was very focused on the defense of Western civilization and disdain for the UN, very much the same as Vance's challenge to them.
Yes and no. Yes, he was pushing them very hard. But there were also some almost lyrical passages in the speech about our shared history, our shared values, our shared faith. So it was not... I think
to a continent which is not very interested in faith anymore, clearly.
Many parts of it, right. But it didn't come across, it didn't sound like someone whose real attitude toward them was disgust. It sounded like someone whose real attitude was worry, concern, hope that things can change. Whereas I think Vance came across as contemptuous and dismissive, which is just tactically not smart, because that's no way to elicit more effort on their part. And the problem with it particularly is if you do that at the time we are suggesting we might use military force against Greenland, against Denmark, a NATO ally, not against Russia, the effect is not going to be helpful. And by the way, it's worth mentioning, there are good NATO allies and bad NATO allies, like Canada, for example, which was a great alliance partner in World War II, has in the more recent decades, under all of its governments, done very little and spending nothing on its defense. Denmark's been a really good ally and was with us, for example, in Afghanistan. Really reliable ally. It's very small, but an alliance is made up of a whole bunch of countries, not just one or two very large ones. And I don't think they deserve the treatment they got.
Well, we're not speaking as much about Greenland since Trump's talk at Davos last month. There was a serious strategic problem that was underneath the bluster and that freaked out the Danes and the other Europeans, but it was related to the broader question of whether they were interested in paying for their own defense rather than merely enjoying the U.S. defense umbrella. So in the end, was this just typical Trump trolling of his critics, the people he doesn't like, rather than an actual threat?
Looked at from today, so it seems. It's easy to offer advice, right? And particularly ex post facto hindsight. But for the president to make the threats he's made about NATO in general, we're not going to carry this forever. If you're uninterested in defending yourself, why should we defend you? Those kinds of general comments worked. And no president before him has been able to get them to spend more on the defense. Vladimir Putin gets some credit for this too, right? Because he scared them. But the president's approach and his rhetoric worked when those of his predecessors failed to get the Europeans to do more. I would distinguish that from the case of Denmark, Greenland, where, again, I think that if we had gone into secret meetings with the Danes and said, look, we have an increased threat in the Arctic. it's going to continue for the coming decades. We have a 1951 treaty. We have actually abandoned something like 11 bases in Greenland. We may want them back. We need to. I think we would have had a yes on everything without the Sturm und Drang that we went through. And again, I think the Danes, as really good allies, did not deserve. I think that was just a mistake.
Mm. Well, let me ask you to sort of take off your Council of Foreign Relations hat for a moment and put on your Tikvah kippah. You're deeply invested in not just promoting Jewish life, but the battle against anti-Semitism. I think most of those involved in that effort have been prepared for and focused on the threat of left-wing anti-Semitism, or at least those of us sort of on the right as opposed to the left, especially since the October 7th attacks unleashed a surge of Jew hatred on college campuses and elsewhere. But in the last several months, there's been no ignoring the growth of a troubling and growing problem of right-wing anti-Semitism, which is not just limited to a few prominent podcasters, but including many of whom who are considered part of the Trump coalition. Given Vice President Vance's publicly stated stance of neutrality about the debate over anti-Semitism on the right, which he articulated at the Turning Point USA Forum in December, and given that he's the obvious right now, albeit 2 years in advance, for the frontrunner for the 2028 GOP nomination, where does that leave conservative pro-Israel Jews such as yourself going forward?
I think it's a real challenge and a real danger. And I think you're right to mention Vice President Vance, because he and obviously President Trump are really in a position to do something that would be meaningful and quick. People, I think, rightly refer to the days when the kind of gatekeeper was William F. Buckley Jr. And his comments about Pat Buchanan and others, and keeping real anti-Semitism out of the conservative movement. I think the president and the vice president could do that. I think they could let, for example, an important example, Tucker Carlson, know that this is now beyond the pale, that he'd gone too far. And maybe they can move him, maybe they could not, but they would at least be stating what standards they thought should apply for the Republican Party. And the refusal to do that, I mean, the president has, denounced anti-Semitism, but he denounced anti-Semitism after having Tucker Carlson to the White House twice in January. So if you will, it doesn't count. I think it's very real, and I think it's very worrying. I do think that for American Jews, it is more important to spend our efforts on ourselves rather than on the anti-Semites. I wrote a book called If You Will It 2 years ago that really talked about what we could do to strengthen our community. And I think the best answer, I think there are two answers to anti-Semitism. One of them is build a better Jewish community, build a stronger Jewish community. And the other is enforce the laws and rules and regulations. What we saw in so many universities, for example, was the refusal, the failure to do that. Jews were not asking for anything new. Rewrite all the rules because they didn't work for it. No, enforce them. Enforce them the way they would be enforced against, say, racists. Enforce them against anti-Semites. That was not being done. So yes, we have a right to absolutely to demand that. But I think, the best reaction is to strengthen the American Jewish community.
Yeah, well, I think you're right about that. And obviously that's what Tikvah is all about. And this is a discussion that's sort of taken off in the last month, and some of it provoked by Bret Stephens' recent speech in which he said we should stop focusing on anti-Semitism since we can't do anything about it because it's a virus that can't be destroyed, which is true. And taking a page from some of your own books, just concentrating on building Jewish life. But do you think that's, just forgetting about anti-Semitism, stop worrying about fighting it, is that a viable strategy with Jew hatred growing on both the left and the right, including an anti-Zionist mayor of New York and some of the loudest voices on the right obsessing with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories?
I would not go as far as Bret Stephens did, who seemed to be suggesting kind of give up the fight against anti-Semitism, because much of what is being done against Jews is criminal. And I don't think that we should let people get away with forms of discrimination and hatred that are illegal, or in colleges that violate rules that have existed for decades and decades. These efforts, for example, to frankly deport some of the people involved who are not Americans, I generally support. I don't think we need to bring people to this country to engage in acts that are A, criminal, and B, hateful against Americans. So I don't take the view that the only thing we should do is, for example, build more Jewish schools.
Although we should be doing that.
Which we should be doing, absolutely. But, this is a little bit reminiscent of the debate go back to the days of the civil rights movement, where the United States adopted new civil rights laws. And the argument against them from some people was you can't legislate morality. And it turned out that was, I would say, wrong. You could, because the legislation reminded everybody this is right and that is wrong. We have moral standards. We have historical standards. We have a constitution and laws. And I think it's important to do that in the context of anti-Semitism too. And to remind people that, for example, harassing a Jewish student on a university campus is not permissible. It may be a crime. It ought, at any rate, to get you kicked out. For a professor to call out a Jewish student or an Israeli student, or to teach what is obviously a ludicrously biased view of what's going on in the Middle East, okay, that may not be a crime, but it should be a violation of academic standards that results in some kind of punishment. So I do think and it is arguably violation of, speaking of the civil rights movement, it is a violation of the Civil Rights Act. Yes. So I don't think we only take care of ourselves. And I do think we should be asking the authorities, the mayor, the governor, the police chief, the university president, to enforce the laws and the rules that exist to protect, in this case, Jews and Israelis in some cases. But I do think, actually, that strengthening the identity of American Jews through things like Jewish schools, Jewish camps, and a key ingredient, I think, time in Israel, should be focuses of American Jewish activity. And I think, by the way, it'll happen. That is, I think if you compare, say, 2000, pick a year, 25 to 2035, I think you are beginning to see already an expansion of Jewish schooling. And under the tax law, the new tax law, there is an opportunity, there will be in states that opt in, for people to get a $1,700 tax credit for donations to Jewish school, to entities that will be funding Jewish schools. It's cost-free if you're a taxpayer. It's a credit, not a deduction. And if you think of millions of Jews doing that, you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars that would be available to go into Jewish schooling, and obviously other, to Catholic schools from Catholics and so on. But we could see a real expansion of the availability of all sorts of Jewish education in the United States. But I go back to your point, the expansion of anti-Semitism on the left and the right is very worrying. You can find some statistics that suggest we may be overstating it a bit, but then you read someone like Rob Dreher, who says, no, you're not exaggerating it at all. It is a gigantic problem related to age mostly, that is particularly among young evangelicals and some young Catholics, and in particular, it seems, recent converts to Catholicism.
Yeah, I think this is a challenge that we're going to have to face. I think that's a good point for us to stop. Elliott, thanks so much for joining us today. How can our audience find out more about Tikvah and follow your work?
For the work on foreign policy, just go to the website of the Council on Foreign Relations, cfr.org, and under experts, click on me, and you'll find everything I'm writing, webcasts, podcasts, and so forth. For Tikvah, it's tikvah.org, and you'll see what Tikvah is doing. We opened our own school in Manhattan. We're doing a lot with universities, with Jewish day schools, with, in particular, the University of Florida and the University of Texas. So there is an enormous amount going on for people from starting really middle school and on up through high school, college, and then, of course, adulthood. So take a look.
Yes, absolutely. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, which you can hear wherever you get your podcasts, and whether you're listening to us on any one of them, watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.